Hello, everyone. So welcome back to the next panel. I have already introduced myself before, so I will go straight into the next panel then. It's a pleasure, first of all, to host this, chair this panel, because it goes straight into some of the dilemma that we have been discussing, in the field of study, but also in practice, especially recently, with, for example, with Afghanistan. So I just wanted to share some words with you before I introduce our guest. The history, and we have, in a way, we also touched some of these things with Faisal Devji before. So the history of humanitarianism is, of course, strictly related to major events or processes, where the very ideas of humanity, compassion, solidarity, and so on are at stake. So indeed, as it has been noted by several scholars, humanitarianism emerged particularly well in moments of radical inhumanity. The anti-slavery movement, the Battle of Solferino, the World Wars, the Rwandan genocide, the Bosnian War, all these, among others, affected not only the ways we think humanitarian work, but also the ways in which humanitarianism is implemented on the ground. The global war on terror, starting in 2001, is of course one of these such global event and phenomena that have changed our way to understand humanitarian interventions. In a broader sense, the global war on terror reshaped the way we think concepts also such as protection and security. And today is particularly focused on protection. So this kind of new configuration of these ideas of, for instance, protection and security, of course, affected the way humanitarian organizations understood their work. And from that very moment, they had to start to also relate with the different stakeholders and actors in a kind of new way, in a new context where, for instance, the boundaries between civil and military interventions were completely blurred. Our guest today will, in this panel, will help us to reflect specifically on the humanitarian negotiations amidst counter-terrorism restrictions, pointing in particular at two dimensions, the legal and diplomatic dimensions of these humanitarian negotiations, and how they take place on the ground. I'm not sure I have to say, what we mean here by humanitarian negotiations, but of course it's clear that wherever it takes place and whoever is involved, humanitarianism always implies a form of negotiation between local populations who receive aid, between state authorities, between local authorities, very often between humanitarian organizations and armed groups, and so on. So our guest will introduce us to these dimensions of the legal implications and the diplomatic ones. Just a few words about them. Sultan Barakat, who you see on screen, is the founding director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. His work has focused on issues related to conflict management, humanitarian responses, and conflict recovery and transition, both as a researcher and as a consultant for several organizations, including the United Nations, the World Bank, and different governments, as well as non-governmental organizations. Emanuela Chiara Gillard, today with us, is a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, and an associate fellow in Chatham House International Law Program. Her research interests include the international humanitarian law with a particular focus on the protection of civilians and mechanisms for promoting compliance, the role of the Security Council in enhancing the protection of civilians, counter-terrorism, and principled humanitarian aid. They will each have a 15-minute, 20 minutes presentation. At the end of each presentation, we can have like a very short round of immediate reactions or questions, if any. and then we will open the floor for a more open and a broader discussion at the end. So we will move back there, Sultan, so that we don't give you our back, and then we come back here. So please start when you are ready, Sultan. He's muted.
He's muted. You need to unmute your microphone, Sultan.
Sir. Hello, everyone. Good evening, or maybe for you it's still good afternoon. I'm Sultan Barakat. I'm the director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies here in Doha. It's a great pleasure to join you today. I had hoped to be with you physically, but unfortunately, because of COVID restrictions, I'm not able to travel. I would like to start by thanking Antonio and Maria for the invitation for this. And also, I should really thank Faisal for the fascinating lecture he gave earlier, which I appreciate both as an academic, but also as a Muslim working in the humanitarian sphere. I think he's touched on a number of issues that we face on a daily basis and are worth exploring in much more detail. In my interventions, and they're really just a set of talking points, I would like to focus directly on the issue between negotiation, which I refer to as dialogue, maybe in a broader sense, and counter-terrorism, or trying to react to these strategies of countering terrorism globally. The starting point, I think, is that we as humanitarians, and to some extent also diplomats, have fallen into this trap of counter-terrorism strategies that have been really underdeveloped, studied, but were very, very quickly to spread and to take a real shape in everyday life, particularly in our region. And what I'm saying, maybe you will not feel it as much in Norway, but in the Middle East and in the Muslim world, I think today, it is part of our daily reality, both the threat of terrorism and the extremely penetrating policies of counterterrorism that has reached every aspect of life, all the way from controlling social media to banking, to trade, and of course, humanitarian work was not an exception. Today, as you know, Facebook controls its posts on Facebook and Twitter and so on, and action is taken to block or suspend accounts. And if you do, just for exercise, a percentage of how many accounts have been blocked, you see that the majority is coming from our region, I think, and it is all been blocked on the assumption that it has a dimension of supporting terrorism of one form or the other. And the truth is that that is actually not true. And the big problem that we face is the fact that we all seem to have submitted to a trend that started really big after 9/11, although it has pre-existed before then, but 9/11 was the turning point. We've all submitted that someone else somewhere there knows better than us about these issues, and therefore we have to take their word at face value and accept those restrictions. We've submitted without demanding even a clear definition of what terrorism actually means. It has resulted in a huge mix-up between rightful and legal rights to resist, say, occupation in the Palestinian territories, or invasion in southern Lebanon, or liberty, demanding liberty in Syria and freedom and dignity. All of these have been labeled as terrorist activities, and as such, they have complicated the scene. So the first point is that there's been very little good definition and an overall submission that somebody else, they wouldn't have done this unless they really had some evidence that something is serious going on somewhere. The second point is that it has had incredible discriminatory and application, almost targeting certain groups, but also extremely difficult to justify objectively. You cannot really say, even if you take for granted that the definition is not as important, the application of these laws are highly selective, and they're inconsistent throughout. And it's not just the imposition of the law and the sanctions and the listing on terrorist lists, but also the removal of terrorist lists and the removal of sanctions has unfortunately been done without sufficient justification, logical justification, which to my mind has actually undermined the status and undermined the cause for countering terrorism as a strategy. To give you one example from our region, the recent delisting and the removal of sanctions on Sudan. Sudan for many years suffered very difficult sanctions that have impeded its development, its progress, and in the wake of the democratic revolution, which was kind of an echoing for the Arab Spring, the economy in Sudan went into a really difficult situation, and there were about $15 billion frozen in United States banks for the Sudanese that were frozen on the basis that these are spoken for as compensation for the victims of the embassy bombings in East Africa, when Osama bin Laden was accused with these bombings, and at the time he lived in Sudan. So Sudan was made to be responsible for those acts, and the money was held back on those bases. Now, without Sudan changing anything in its strategy, and without us knowing what exactly has happened in terms of the qualitative differences in the approach that got them listed in the first place or delisted later on, they were magically taken off and of the sanctions, and the system was corrected, and the money flew back, much of it to Sudan, when the Sudanese agreed to normalize relationship with Israel. Now, that kind of action really undermines the strategy, and it particularly does so in the eyes of those who have been victimized by the strategy and have had to deal with its consequences. The same way, as some of you may know, I have been closely following the negotiations between the Americans and the Taliban, and later between the Taliban and the Taliban. The listing of the Taliban members has, right from the beginning, been used as a carrot, or the delisting of the Taliban members has been used as a carrot to try and encourage them to engage in the negotiation without necessarily clarifying what are the qualitative differences they need to make, what are the steps these people need to make to get off the list. And we all know how easy it is to be listed, but it is very, very difficult to get delisted. And as such, it raises the question of hypocrisy, the question of consistency, and all of that, I think, combined adds to the challenges that we face as humanitarians in these fields. The next point, which is also related, is that by defining people or naming them as terrorists or grouping them in these groups, there seems to be a divorce between the humanitarian principles and the consequences of countering terrorism. All actions are somehow acceptable. The disproportionate destruction of a city like Mosul in the name of flashing out Daesh is one example. It has gone on and on and on and on. They've thrown at them everything that they could on a handful, hundreds of fighters who had light weapons at the time. So disproportionately is something that no one is questioning anymore when it comes to communities or groups that are accused of being of association with terrorism. We face the same problem with the many camps in the northern Syria and northern Iraq, where until today, the wives of Daesh and their children, for now, some of them are approaching adult age. They have been stuck in these places with no concern, or little concern, I should say, from the international community. Countries of origin are not interested in allowing them back, and they are not necessarily enjoying a great or even the decent minimum situation that one would expect. Another example, and this is I recently visited northern Syria with my students. It was really shocking to see how many people, millions of people, live in these enclaves in the north of Syria in a situation very similar to what has been created in Gaza. Total isolation from the rest of the world, total dependence on one state, be it Israel, Turkey, wherever, and total indignity in their way of existence. We have communities that have now almost 10 years continue to live in tents, and again, under the same pretext of countering terrorism, the international community keeps out of the context. The humanitarian agencies at best operate from proxy or using proxy agencies, very little presence for humanitarian agencies in this area. And in fact, it was really surprising. The first time ever I go into a context, you don't see land cruisers, you don't see flags flying around, there are no logos, nothing. Everybody is trying to do their very best, but extremely quietly under the table, trying to help people who are being damned mostly by the fact that Jabhat al-Nusra is the most powerful political entity in this area. We also have a new phenomena which started to affect our work, is that in the past people were relying quite a bit on the United Nations listing and delisting. Now the United States does its own, and in many ways it's probably more effective or stronger and more feared than the United Nations, partly because of the financial transactions and the power the United States has in terms of the dollar and any transactions for humanitarian aid and so on. But the new phenomena we're now living is that regional countries started to do their own list. And that has really, really confused the whole situation. So a lot of political opposition, individuals that you and I may have worked with or have met, who have open channels of communication with unsavory figures, are now being listed by countries like United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. They started to do their own thing outside the United Nations system. Now, the danger of this is that when it's all put together and international databases get accessed, now they have much easier way to access each other. Nobody is asking about the reasoning why these people have been listed and what is the consequence and so on. So the risk is much greater, and all of this is being reflected on the ability to really engage with people on the ground. And I think a very fundamental issue for us is the importance of dialogue. You cannot resolve any problem without talking, and labeling a group in advance without having sufficient evidence, without understanding the reason why they're labeled, without having a definition and so on, is impeding very much, is inhibiting any idea, any possibilities of communication. This is something that we suffered from early on in, and I'm sure maybe some colleagues from Norway as well, in the early contacts with the Taliban, for example. And we have tried to work around it as much as possible. But I think now, only now, people appreciate that if it wasn't for that dialogue, and if it wasn't for many, many, many years of contact between the Taliban political office and its members with the rest of the world, with the international community, with the humanitarian community, I don't think the results would have been as they unfolded on the 15th of August. Their takeover of Kabul, I genuinely believe, could have been much more bloody. Regardless of what we think of their political stand and so on, it has been remarkable that there were no massacres, no violent reaction, that until today there are no systematic killing going on in the country. We used to witness up to 350 dead every day just before the 15th of August, and that has now largely disappeared. There's a greater degree of security and so on. Now that change, and I can maybe talk about this later on in the discussion, there's been a major change in the way the philosophical underpinning, I think, of the whole movement. That change would not have been possible without open dialogue, without, not necessarily open, but dialogue and discussion and contact with the rest of the world. So to conclude, I think as humanitarians, we do have the responsibility to try and keep the channels of communications open as much as possible. We cannot pretend and say we are neutral and impartial, but we are only neutral and impartial when it comes to politics. There are certain things like accusation of terrorism, then we stop. And we stop, I understand why we all stop, because of fear of implications on certain strategies and so on. I think it is important to appreciate that there are different understandings for the concept and different applications. And as such, we need to be able to be one step ahead of this discourse. And there is a desperate need for a greater engagement that goes beyond the very niche of what is allowed for ICRC and one or two agencies. I think increasingly very day-to-day work of humanitarian work requires engagement, and it should be allowed, and people should be prepared to have those discussions. I'll stop here and I'll come back maybe in the discussion session. Antonio.
Thank you, Sultan. So if there are immediate questions or reactions, we can take it. A few now. I do have a few comments and questions. Well, I can share now, and then we move to the next topic, and then maybe we go back to them afterwards. So one was what you said about the negotiations. I think it was indeed something that was important to not seeing massacres in Afghanistan after the Taliban's takeover. Although we could also say that the negotiation between the Taliban and the US, excluding the Afghan government initially, compromised the whole process afterwards. So when the Taliban started to negotiate with the Afghan government after that, maybe it was already too late. So the idea of and the way, I mean, the whole process took place in a way compromised the possibility of a different takeover eventually. But this is, of course, is a big political thing. One other comment that I have is about the position of humanitarian organizations now, because in Afghanistan at the moment, one of probably of the most pressing things is the food crisis that Afghanistan is about to face. Basically, there is a form of embargo on the country now. There are a lot of restrictions in terms of aid. Organizations are, afraid to commit because they don't want to recognize, to be involved in a sort of unofficial recognition of the Taliban government and so on. And those who are paying now, of course, are the Afghan citizens who have been completely dependent on foreign aid for 20 years, where there's been a kind of failure in helping Afghanistan to become independent economically. And suddenly, most of it was stopped in August or September in some cases. So there has been this kind of clash in this form of high dependency of the country to foreign aid for 20 years. and then a sudden stop. And now the consequences are that there is a harsh food crisis and health crisis in the country, and so on. Of course, also with the implications of the chaotic evacuations. One of these is, so I recently had the opportunity to interview some Afghan judges who left the country, particularly women judges who left the country in August. And it's clear that the evacuation, especially from some sector of the state apparatus, left the country without the proper competencies to go on. In the judiciary now, I mean, with the evacuation has been basically devastated. So in the country now, there are very few competent judges. So for a very few who were able to escape, the situation is very complicated now there. So yeah, these were just two immediate reactions. Yes, we have another comment, please.
I don't know if he is going to.
No, I think you're far away. Yeah, you're it's better.
Can you hear me, Sultan?
Yes, just.
Right, I'll stand here.
Here is
Yeah, yeah?
Yeah,
Okay.
perfect.
Hello, Sultan. I don't know what time is in there. Good evening, then.
Good evening.
Yeah. My name is Zahir
Hello,
from
Zahir.
Afghanistan. Thank you, Sultan, for your insight, but I've got some comments. One was that the ill-functioned Doha peace process, which caused to the collapse of a democratic system, to a Talibanism. You have said that the Taliban is not killing people anymore. It was because the Doha process, we have taught them not to kill people, but there was 1,000 people in 3 months was disappeared and killed. It was announced by the UN office. And also, is the process still going on to delist these people? Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Can I respond now or after?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Let me start with Zahir's point, because I think it's a very important one. The Doha talk did not get rid of a democratic system. It's the way the conflict has concluded is the one that has given the upper hand to the Taliban. And it is linked maybe to what Antonio has said about excluding the Afghan government. The government of Ghani totally misread and underestimated the determination of the United States to withdraw. And they've misread the history. I mean, from 2011, if you remember, in Lisbon, the NATO took the decision to drop down the forces in preparation to withdraw from Afghanistan. And this happened in the days of Obama and Biden as a vice president. President Ghani was not willing to engage with the Americans in the talks for a long time, and as a result, they went ahead without him. And it's not true that they were excluded. On the very day the Taliban signed an agreement with the Americans in Doha, the Americans signed a mirror image agreement with the Afghans in Kabul in the presence of senior Americans in Kabul at the same time, simultaneously. And those agreements were, as you'd expect, focused on Americans' priorities. It's about the United States priority, which was about countering terrorism and security arrangement. I think this is very important. I tried to allude to it at the beginning that we get all hijacked by this counter-terrorism agenda, and Afghanistan is one very important example of that. Now, Ghani insisted on his advisors, kept advising him that Biden coming to power will reverse the position of the United States, and that was a major miscalculation. Biden came, and if anything, he accelerated the rate in which the United States was willing to leave Afghanistan. And if you remember, February last year, he sent this terrible letter to President Ghani, which was then leaked to the media, in which he totally undermined the president's position. So I don't think it was because the Taliban played it smartly or anything. This is the result of a much bigger politics that was playing out in Afghanistan. In terms of the killing that is ongoing, I think it's debatable. And yesterday I had here the Minister of Education, and I'm happy to speak about their approach to women education and girls if you want me to. And before that, we had 4 senior ministers also meeting donors in my office here. So the statistics amongst the donors and what they take is very much echoing what I said, that there has been very little systematic or state violence being subjected to the population. There are, of course, crimes, there are things happening, but there is very little evidence of the state doing it at the moment. In terms of humanitarian organizations, they are facing a really difficult decision, partly because of our own fault as humanitarians. We have not revisited or defined the concept well enough to include what Afghanistan needs today. Afghanistan does not necessarily now needs food to be shipped from the United States to Pakistan, through Pakistan to Afghanistan. There are the strategies that have been now that are folding out, including the beans. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to cook some of this black beans that comes from the United States. It will consume a whole tree to cook half a kilo. It is very difficult, and it has been an issue for a long, long time. And we've written about this, and there was an op-ed a few weeks ago, where I think what they need to do is a more balanced food collection within the country and food distribution within the country. In different corners of the country, there is oversupply of fruits, of wheat, food, and there is under supply in other areas. And the doing things as usual, as we're most comfortable with, is undermining everyone's case. First, by giving this ready product from outside, I think the economy, Afghanistan has passed this stage because of the 20 years of relative development that happened. And going back to relief as usual is not going to help. Also, it will not help to channel all the relief because it's coming from abroad. It needs a port. It's coming to Pakistan, from Pakistan to Afghanistan. That link between Pakistan and Taliban is something that is now being questioned by the Taliban, and it is something that maybe I think it's in the interest of the world to take them off the Pakistan stage. And aid will bring them back under the authority of Pakistan. And you may have heard already about the shipment that was sent by Turkey via Pakistan, and only 10% of it went into Afghanistan, and there were a lot of issues around it. So it is difficult, but we need to think differently. We need to accept, for example, that education and health as an institution and not just as a product is part of our humanitarian response. We need to be able to protect those institutions, particularly given that more than 50% of the employees in those institutions are women. So instead of supporting in addition to supporting a lot of advocacy campaigns in support of women, we have a genuine, real opportunity to support women in their employment. And as such, maybe very easy, very quick way to do it is to support the salaries of some of these employees. In the Ministry of Education, 200 out of 370,000, I don't know exact figure, but lots of employees, the 2/3 of the civil service probably in the Ministry of Education, and more than 50% of those are women, have been without income for 4 months now. 2 months before, more, is entering 5th month, 2 months before the fall and since the fall. Now, those women have families. Many of them are heading households because of the death of their partners, refugees, people went abroad to work and so on. And they are being left until they reach the stage. They've already eaten into their savings if they're any. The banking system is collapsed. It's not allowed. Transactions are not allowed. And we are still talking about basic humanitarian needs, and the agencies are talking about getting food and wash and shelter to those areas where the needs are very, very different. And if anything, I think we should learn from Syria. We should go to cash aid. We should do things that help the economy regardless of the politics. I personally don't have any strong feelings for Taliban or the others. We had our ups and downs with both sides, but I think for the people of Afghanistan, the best way forward is to help them save whatever is left out of those 20 years of investment. 20 years of investment evaporated, the security evaporated overnight, which was absolutely incredible. And now we have the risk of losing whatever is left in terms of local government, health, education infrastructure. And many of those infrastructures were already reliant on private sector, reliant on NGOs. So they had created opportunities for other actors in this field. And a lot of it is under threat at the moment. And finally, if I may comment on the point of the evacuation and the skills by Antonio, I totally agree. I mean, my own personal view is maybe 9 out of 10 people who were evacuated were unnecessarily taken out of the country, given the commitments that was made by the Taliban. And the commitment, you know, I know it's very difficult to trust. It's impossible for some people who've been through the 1990s, have experienced them then. But the reality is that they have stuck to their promises, you know, inch by inch since they started their counterattack on Kabul. And that's the important point. The attack was a counterattack to an attack by the government, supported by B-52s from the United States a few days earlier. They accepted the conditions. They accepted that they will stop outside Kabul. President Ghani and the government will maintain control of the capital. The Americans will control the airport. And meanwhile, for 2 weeks, the situation will continue and they would work out the next government. Now, they may not have been, they may have hidden other intentions, but until that point, they stuck to their agreement. And unfortunately, when the president fled the palace, it has unbalanced the whole situation. The evacuation, as I said, I think a lot of it was totally unnecessary. It was maybe important for the West to show that they care and that they are not leaving as they did in the previous time. They care for those who worked with them, etc., etc. It has deprived the country of a lot of skilled people, particularly in certain areas. But also the positive news, and this is from the chairman of the Tolo News, the agency in Afghanistan, is that the 20 years of investment in the country has actually created a deeper layer of capacity than we had thought. And he was able to replace almost every cameraman, man or woman, presenters and so on within 2 weeks. And we hear the same from different ministries, from different agencies. There is quite a good number of highly qualified, and this is a credit, I think, to the 20 years of investment. There are more than 1 million plus people with master's degree and BAs in the country now that did not exist 20 years ago. There are very active women, actors and so on, activists. And I think it's not all as bad as it could have been. And to go back to Zahir's, the contact they've had with the world has been absolutely central to them accepting the change. And I'll give you one last example and then I'll shut up. A few days ago, if you following the news, the Taliban appointed Secretary General for the Red Crescent, Sheikh Torabi, who is on the terrorist list. And I was contacted, as many others, by various people, very concerned because the international community is no longer going to channel aid through to the Red Crescent because of this person being on the as Secretary General. Now, There was a meeting held, very detailed discussions onto how the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement work, pointing out opportunities for aid to flow into the country, that this is the only line that exists at the moment when you have everything else crippled. Why would you do this? Why would you have a man who's listed in this position? We've heard the argument, they've heard the discussion. A day later, he was removed. Now, this is very different from the position that they've taken on Minister of Defense, of course, and the Minister of Interior. When you argue with them why the Minister of Interior is Haqqani, for God's sake, their answer is, well, show me someone who's willing to cross him. They're using the reputation and the power of the man in that capacity. And there are a lot of examples. I can go on and on. I think maybe if you want, we can discuss in much detail. All what I'm saying is that whoever the party is, we must talk to them. We must find the appropriate way to speak to them. We must find the right people who can communicate with them. Just to send them a delegation is no good. To just send randomly anyone because we think he's a senior diplomat who served in this country or that country is not good. We have to bring ourselves down to where they are and work from where they sit and not from where we'd like them to be. And ultimately, I think life will be saved and humanitarian assistance will be delivered.
Thanks. I think we can take one last comment or question, and then we move to the next one. Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Mustafa Mastur. I have a very concrete comment. I just don't want to derogate the discussion to some other way. First, I want to thank you for your presentation, but I think we have to be very careful about how to describe Taliban and not white painting them, because we know how Taliban have been, what they are capable, what they have been doing in Afghanistan in the last 2.5 decades. I was there until very recently and had to leave Afghanistan. I think in a country where journalists cannot report freely from the whole country, especially, for example, from Panjshir Valley, if you have heard of, where mass killings have happened, the forced movements of people from several cities, the mass killings in Daikundi and Panjshir, etc., and also the land confiscating in Jowzjan, which happened very recently. So I do agree with you when you say that we should have the dialogue with all parties. That's very important, of course. But what happens with Afghans today in Afghanistan, I think we should not underestimate the brutality of Taliban. The only thing that they are doing today is just to get the recognition of the Western world for their regime. That's why they are playing nice. But what they are not nice. We have seen that in the last 2.5 decades, and we are seeing even today. When I contact my colleagues back in Afghanistan, I worked in the security sector. They are disappearing day by day in Afghanistan, and people are being killed just 2 days ago in Kunduz, also some security forces. So I think we, at the same time that we do see the need for support to civilians, the aid and the humanitarian support, at the same time we have to have this knowledge that the support should not go to the regimes that are not supporting human rights. The very fundamental human rights are not respected by Taliban today, and I think that's something that we all can agree upon. But how can we help Afghans? That's another question that I hope other colleagues can answer to. Thank you.
Thank you. Important point. So, Sultan, I ask you to hold on your answer or response if you have one. And we move to the next presentation from Emanuela. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to come to this from a slightly different perspective. I'm a lawyer, so I think it would be very useful to have a discussion of what the regulatory framework of counterterrorism and sanctions are when it comes to their impact on humanitarian action. And I came to this field completely accidentally. I was in fact working on restriction on humanitarian access in general. And in the past decade, and in fact even longer, progressively, it was the tensions posed by counterterrorism measures, by restrictions in sanctions more broadly, that have become the greatest impediment, the greatest challenge to humanitarian actors' capacity to operate in accordance with humanitarian principles, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, and as foreseen by international humanitarian law across contexts. And my work focuses on the impact of counterterrorism measures and sanctions on humanitarian action, on humanitarian response. Today's conversation is about counterterrorism more broadly, and obviously the counterterrorism framework has a very significant impact on human rights far more broadly. That's far less the focus of what I am going to talk about, but there are clear moments of overlap in terms of the restrictions that counterterrorism measures pose on human rights and the restrictions they pose on humanitarian action. To give you a very recent example, as you'll be aware, recently Israel designated 6 NGOs. This was part of the choking of civic space in Israel, but it obviously has very clear impact on humanitarian action as well, as these 6 organizations were in fact delivering humanitarian assistance in Gaza and the West Bank. It's very important for all of us here today. When I came in, I said, who's here? I see people in suits. Are they state reps? I think that it's very important for states in their role as the parties that often impose and definitely implement counterterrorism measures and sanctions, states in their capacities as donors, humanitarian actors, and also those of us who are helping with the policy thinking. It's very important for all of us to be aware of the underlying rules. Why? To the extent that they are applicable, that they are in fact applicable, and I'll come to this in a moment, humanitarian actors must comply with the relevant rules. The problem is that there's frequently over-compliance with the rules, both by humanitarian actors in the field, but also states in their capacity as donors, also the private sector. We've heard the role of the banking sector and how that is also affecting humanitarian action. There's a tendency to over-comply with the rules, to go over and above the requirements of the law. Now, there may be very good reasons for doing this. The law is just one part of the concerns that humanitarian actors take into account. There are very clear reputational concerns in terms of being seen too closely in a warm relationship with designated groups or entities. That's fine. That's something that humanitarian actors and also donors need to be aware of and take into account. But it's very important that we be aware of the law so that we don't mistakenly over-comply with it. And it's also important to be familiar with the law in order to be able to push back against it. Push back against it when particular actors over-apply it. It could be states as donors. It could be the banking sector that has a misunderstanding of the law. So it's important to be able to push back. It's also important to know what the law is in order to be able to propose ways of improving it, of making smart sanctions even smarter. And it's also important in terms of finding appropriate solutions. So this is what I've actually been doing a lot of in the past 10 years, very much engaging at different levels, engaging with humanitarian actors in the field to help them unpack the problems they are facing. The fluidity crisis in Afghanistan today. Let's really determine, to the extent that we can, what it is due to and what it is not due to. But also in terms of helping states try to find solutions that balance the interests, to go back to the first presentation, the interests that states have in reaching certain policy objectives, such as countering terrorism, promoting compliance with IHL and human rights, balancing that with the adverse effect of the measures they impose. Now, as I said, I'm coming to this with a very particular angle. I'm looking at the impact of counterterrorism measures and sanctions on humanitarian action, on the capacity of humanitarian actors to operate in accordance with international humanitarian law and with humanitarian principles. I am not going to look at other relevant questions, some of which have come up today. I'm not going to look at whether sanctions or counterterrorism measures should have been imposed in a particular context, yes or no. I'm not going to look at whether or not they are effective in reaching their policy objectives. And I'm not going to look at the question of whether a particular individual or group should or should not have been designated in a particular context. They are very live, relevant questions, but when I speak to humanitarians, I say they're not questions for you. Your question is understanding the framework that currently exists, making sure you comply with the bits that are applicable, and also finding ways, if it is problematic, finding ways to push back, to improve the system. So that's the particular angle that we're looking at. Which counterterrorism measures pose the greatest challenges for humanitarian action? And what we have seen in the past decade is that in order to capture the evolving manifestations of terrorism, the acts criminalized either by the Security Council or by states individually have become progressively more remote from actual acts of violence. Initially, it was actual acts of violence that were designated as terrorist under the various counter-terrorism conventions. But we are seeing a progressive move away to that, to criminalization, prohibition of ever broader forms of support to terrorism. And as far as humanitarian action is concerned, it is the measures that prohibit the provision of funds or assets or other types of support to groups designated as terrorist that raise the most significant tensions. And restricting the flow of funds to organizations designated as terrorist is a core component of the international community's counterterrorism strategy. And as a matter of law, this is achieved by two principal ways. The first is financial sanctions imposed on groups that are designated as terrorist. These sanctions require the freezing of the assets that some groups may have abroad, but also, and significantly for humanitarian action, they prohibit providing funds, assets, or economic resources to such groups, directly or indirectly. The second means are criminal counterterrorism measures that make it an offence to carry out a range of activities that may provide financial assistance or other forms of support to designated groups or for the commission of terrorist acts. So where do we find these prohibitions? Chronologically, the first instrument was the 1999 International Convention for the Suppression of Terrorist Financing. It was the first instrument to address this topic, and it requires states to make it an offence to provide or collect funds by any means with the intention that they are used or in the knowledge that they're going to be used in full or in part to carry out an act of terrorism. So it's actually a it's a narrow crime. The funds need to be provided to carry out an act of terrorism. This is very unlikely to cover funds or assets provided in the course of humanitarian activities because there is no intention that they be used to carry out an act of terrorism. Significantly, though, 20 years ago. Since 2001, it is the UN Security Council that has taken center stage in developing the international counterterrorism framework and requiring states to take a number of measures. These include the imposition of financial sanctions on groups designated as terrorist. And this is done in two ways. First, the Security Council has itself established a sanctions regime that specifically focuses now on ISIL and Al-Qaeda. As of June 2021, there's 72 groups and 425 individuals under this very specific sanctions regimes. And there's a prohibition on making funds, assets, or other resources available directly or indirectly to these designated groups. And if you look at where these groups are present, the groups that have been designated under the ISIL Al-Qaeda sanctions regime, they have a presence in many of the areas where there are civilians in need, either under their control or in the area in need of humanitarian assistance. The second way the Security Council has done this is through the first resolution in a series of counterterrorism resolutions adopted in the immediate aftermath of the attacks of September 11, Resolution 1373. This includes states to adopt a number of measures, including financial sanctions, adopting financial sanctions. However, this resolution does not, in fact, provide a list of who these groups are. It is left to individual states to adopt their own list. And this has meant that there is a very significant number of different lists adopted by different states. The EU, for example, has adopted its own list. In addition, states may have expanded, including new and additional individuals. Other resolutions in this series adopted by the Security Council require states to take a wide range of measures to counter terrorism. For example, there's a resolution of 2014 on foreign fighters that requires states to criminalize their travel for the purpose of perpetration planning or participation in terrorist act or receiving or providing terrorist training. Again, it is left to individual states to give effect to this. And what we see is that some states have adopted very broad approaches to it, because it is difficult to determine whether someone has traveled to a particular context for the purpose of committing these types of activities. A small number of states, Australia, the United Kingdom, Denmark, and in the Netherlands, it's currently before Parliament, have prohibited any form of travel to particular areas. Now, obviously, these are the very same area to which humanitarian actors may have to travel in order to respond. And again, a moment of tension between the criminalization and the need to conduct humanitarian activities that needs to be resolved by appropriate exceptions. Why do these, the third, so we've got conventions, we've got Security Council resolutions and sanctions, and the third source of counterterrorism restrictions are funding agreements for humanitarian action. Donors to humanitarian actions frequently impose restrictions and requirements in funding agreements to ensure the funds don't reach designated entities. Clearly, these can also raise challenges for the capacity of humanitarian actors to operate in accordance with humanitarian principles. Why do these measures pose a problem for humanitarian actors? The groups that are designated under counterterrorism measures are frequently organized armed groups, parties to non-international armed conflict, with control over civilian populations in severe need. We can, just to mention a few, Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula in Yemen, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, ISIL affiliates in Syria and until recently in Iraq, and in the Sahel region, Boko Haram in Nigeria. I'm naming very many contexts where there are severe needs. We can have a long conversation about Afghanistan if we like afterwards, a focus of my recent work. It's important to bear in mind that the Taliban per se was never designated under UN Security Council measures. Not the Taliban. A number of individuals who now have assumed responsibilities in the new government. There are a number of ministers designated, and also still to this day, the vice president of the Afghan Red Crescent Society. He is designated by UN sanctions. So obviously there are problems, but not the Taliban per se. And I'm happy to continue these conversations. And problems arise because the restrictions have been applied very broadly and can capture payments and activities carried out in the course of humanitarian action. How? Humanitarian actors may have to make incidental payments to designated entities in order to operate. Who's been to Gaza? In order to get into Gaza, you need to pay $25 visa to get in to Hamas. You can't even start operating without paying that. I think questions have now arisen in relation to Afghanistan because a number of the ministers are designated, including the Minister of Finance. What does that mean if I have to pay tax for my national staff? Does that mean that by paying tax and therefore making a payment to the Ministry of Finance, I am somehow violating the prohibition on making assets and funds available to the minister? I don't think so, but it's raised a lot of questions. I'm happy to discuss these. Humanitarian consignments or relief goods may be diverted and end up in the hands of designated groups. Is that indirectly providing funds to them? More alarmingly, medical care. There have been instances in which there have been investigations for the provision of medical care to members of designated groups. This is particularly problematic because the entitlement to receive and the protection of those who provide medical care is a foundational principle of international humanitarian law. And here we are seeing a movement towards criminalizing the provision of medical care. Prohibition on travel, as I was saying, may also be problematic because the areas to which foreign fighters travel are also areas to which humanitarian actors may travel. So as I was saying, if the crimes are framed too broadly, there's a very live risk that travel by humanitarian action may also be covered. Something that I really want to emphasize, though, and this is usually when I stand up in my presentation, I'm Italian, I will. What's very important to bear in mind, and it links up with the humanitarian negotiations, is there is no prohibition as a matter of law anywhere on contact with designated groups or designated individuals. I stand up because I cannot say this clearly enough. I cannot say this often enough. It is really the greatest source of unwarranted self-restriction across contexts. There is no such prohibition. There is no prohibition in sanctions. Sanctions are about making funds or assets available directly or indirectly. It says nothing on contact. There is no prohibition in the criminal law of any state. There's no prohibitions in the international conventions. There's no prohibition in the criminal laws of any state. I'm not going to enter into the details here. I set it all out in this long Chatham House report that actually goes through the various laws adopted by a number of states. It's not criminal. The only time in which there has been a restriction has been through a funding agreement. The funding agreement of one state, the US, in relation to one context, Gaza. There, recipients of US funding have been precluded from engaging with Hamas. That's the only instance in which we have a prohibition. And it was political in nature rather than based on counterterrorism, because there's many other groups designated by the US operative in Gaza, but they haven't. There isn't a similar restriction. So I really cannot emphasize this enough. As a matter of law, there is no restriction on contact. Contact is necessary in order to be able to carry out humanitarian activities. It's expressly foreseen in IHL. It is necessary in order to be able to operate and to do so safely. But we keep on forgetting this and somehow unwarrantedly holding ourselves back as humanitarians. And this is really something that needs to be clarified. And I'd love to say for once and for all, but it'll never be for once and for all, but let's take this opportunity to make it clear again. And that's how my presentation links in with humanitarian negotiations. Reverberating effects. In addition to, one of the problems is that all the measures I've outlined are binding not just on humanitarian actors, but also private actors. such as banks, such as commodities providers. And they are very concerned that by providing services to humanitarian actors, they may be directly or indirectly violating sanctions. And we've seen this a lot in relation to banks. The reality is most humanitarian actors are low profit, high risk, and banks have severely curtailed the services they're willing to provide to humanitarian actors, to the extent that I remember the legal advisor of a very significant NGO saying, it is banks that dictate where we can operate. So very much a live concern and a different conversation. It's not just bank, it's commodity providers. Some of them just simply say, we cannot take the time and energy required to go through the hoops of obtaining licenses in order to provide commodities for humanitarian actors in certain contexts. It is too time consuming, it's too expensive. So clear cascading effect of these restrictions that have a very live impact on humanitarian action. And I think that's what we're seeing in Afghanistan today. Although the restrictions might not actually be covering many of the things, there's just a reluctance to go there. It's too complicated, it's too risky. How to resolve these tensions? Well, as a matter of law, this can be done fairly easily by including measures to safeguard humanitarian action, so exceptions. Neither the 1999 Terrorist Convention nor the first Security Council resolution included exceptions, let alone mentioned humanitarian action. And I think there was just no awareness of the possible consequences, and it is precisely as a result of this that we're facing the problems of today. I'm not going to go into the details now, but I would say, thanks to the efforts of humanitarian actors to flag the problems, we are seeing a progressive realization of the challenges, and slowly, at Security Council level and also in domestic legislation, we are beginning to see exceptions for humanitarian action. So to give you an example, I mentioned 4 states that had criminalized travel to certain areas. All 4 states have some type of safeguard to allow humanitarian action to occur. My concluding points, I didn't see when I started speaking, just some concluding reflections. Where are we at now in 2021, so 20 years on? It is a complex framework, complex legal framework. It is constantly evolving. You just see states adopting new measures, and it's very difficult to stay on top of it in terms of trying to ensure that there are adequate safeguards. At the same time, I feel heartened. I feel we've reached a turning point, that now states are aware of the issues, and that if you look at the most recent Security Council resolution on terrorist fighting, it includes among the binding paragraphs a paragraph that says states, when giving effect to counter-terrorism measures at domestic level, must ensure that they comply with international law, including IHL. That's very strong language that needs to be taken up by states domestically when giving effect to it. We're seeing it across contexts. At the moment, in relation to the Afghanistan sanctions, states are considering the inclusion of an exception along the lines of that exists in the Somalia sanctions. So it is positive. I think it's complex in terms of the range of stakeholders. We have states, NGOs that need to engage, and the need for joined up thinking, on this within states. There are many different parts of states involved in this issue. You have the parts of states that deal with criminal justice, treasuries, foreign affairs. They don't all have the same approach to humanitarian action, the same interests. There isn't often joined up thinking between them. So very difficult to inject a humanitarian perspective even within governments. I think one of the other challenges is that there's actors involved with whom we as humanitarians don't naturally engage with, banks. The conversation you have with a state when you want it to comply with IHL, with humanitarian principles, is one based on international humanitarian law, or the desire of that particular state for humanitarian action to take place. That's not going to work with banks. They don't have obligations under IHL. They don't particularly have any interest in humanitarian action happening. You need to persuade them in different ways. And finally, going forward, as I said, encouraging developments at Security Council level, encouragement at criminal law domestically, and I say, is Afghanistan actually a moment of opportunity in terms of taking this forward? Because the need for humanitarian action is so evident. And there is a desire by states for it to continue, including because development action has been shut off, that it might actually be an opportunity to improve the system, to take it that step forward, to address many of the legal questions that we've seen today. But obviously this is something that needs to be done in a very progressive manner, context by context, but it does build up progressive good practice.
Thanks a lot, Emanuela. This was very informative also for the nuances provided into the realm of possibilities in the field. So I do have some, if there are no others, a couple of immediate points. One was, I was thinking, so there is, of course, the rule of the games, and you have been very clear about that. And then there is how people play. And very often these are a bit inconsistent, especially in the context of conflicts and so on. So, for example, you can of course say a lot and very clearly what was the specific mandate of the U.S. military forces in Afghanistan, what was their role there, and yet you have all the gray areas of understanding what, for example, the CIA-supported militias were doing in the country, right? So you have all these kind of different angles to observe something. And of course, then also it's important to understand the reception and the perception of these things. So, for example, for a person in Afghanistan, when you see such a confusion, then it's very difficult to understand, oh, this is part of, this bombing was enduring freedom, but this military, they are working for ISAF. Oh, no, but then the drones are with the CIA. So everything is up, so everything goes together in a way. So this kind of confusion, in a way, becomes difficult to, districate on the field. But it's already there also in a kind of policy, on the policy agenda. And then, as you said, but let's look at exactly what is possible to do in terms of restrictions at the moment and so on. But then humanitarian organizations, they face other issues that are more, not very much legal to some extent, but more political and so on. So, and then we already mentioned, for example, the fear of being associated with helping the Taliban and so on. So these are was my, how do you navigate this complexity of, the rule of the games and how people play. And the second was, a very important point, that is the increasing criminalization of different things. And we have seen that even in the migration, for example, field, there has been an increasingly criminalization of migrants, also in the framework of seeing the terrorist threat in migration flows. So that is also something that is a very important point where it is difficult to intervene, because basically it's kind of the domain of the state. Yes, so these are my quick points, but if there are others we can collect. Can see anyone here? Sultan, yeah, please. You have to unmute, Sultan.
Sorry. First, I'd like to thank Emanuel. I think it's very informative and really important points she made. And I wish I personally had listened to her a while ago. I think I fully agree that there is an over-compliance. And for example, on the point of talking to the groups, but also there are also gray areas. For example, you can talk, but you cannot offer them coffee. You can talk, but you cannot travel to them or they travel to you. You can, so in a way, the internet has now helped, but still it is not the best medium to communicate in terms of trust building and security and so on. But they're important areas. The other, which I think really very much is at the core of this, it remains to be a political tool in the hands of the powerful. This whole sanctions, no matter how we say the law, its interpretation and so on, at the end of the day, it seems to go back to the Security Council and they reach a deal of some sort. I mentioned Sudan as an example. I'd be interested in your feedback on that. But also the way they handled the Morocco case with the Sahara. Again, the United States accepting the Moroccan recognition of the Sahara, Western Sahara, as part of Morocco. And now it is a real issue between the Taliban and the rest of the world. That they are 100% convinced that they were not terrorists, they were fighting a war to get rid of what they perceived as an occupation. And you rightly say they were not listed as a Taliban, but the individuals were listed, and then these are used as bargains. What I was saying earlier, there is no objective measure set as to what you need to do to reform to be taken off the list. It is traded against something else. And what is very worrying now is that it has even been put on the table to trade against flexibility in education, flexibility in women's access to rights and so on, which really puts the whole situation into a much more dangerous terrain, almost similar to the fact that damage or collateral damage as a result of countering terrorism is tolerated. Nobody is holding anyone accountable to these measures that are taken, whether with drones or without drones. The endless number of weddings that have been hit in Yemen, in Afghanistan, the attacks on Gaza and so on. These are going unnoticed, and in a way, if there is no public understanding, I know it's not just about the niche lawyers, which is great, you understand this, we need to understand it, and more so, people need to, the whole world needs to understand why this is important, how it works, and so on. And this at the moment is totally missing. Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead.
Where am I looking? I'm nodding at you. Thank you. Very important points. And I'm going to actually regroup the comments in three sets. Antonio, non Lorenzo. Antonio. So Antonio and Sultan both raised some points that are not, that relate to the interplay between counterterrorism and international humanitarian law, the rules that regulate the conduct of hostilities. And it wasn't something I wanted to address, but I will. And I think we all need to be very clear that merely labeling something as counterterrorism does not mean that you can suddenly say, and that's fine, all the rules that regulate the conduct of hostilities are no longer applicable. That's just not right. The moment a situation, and sorry, I'm being a niche lawyer, but the moment a situation meets the criteria for amounting to an armed conflict, and I would say that all the contexts we're talking about today definitely amounted to armed conflict, then international humanitarian law applies, and it applies even if a state calls it counterterrorism. So when we were referring to the incident, the collateral damage, or the disproportionate effects of attacks that came up during the discussion, they are regulated by international humanitarian law. It's very possible that a number of incidents actually did violate international humanitarian law. So there are clear rules out there. I think the problem is accountability. Is there accountability for violation of these rules? Magne? Oh, taking the floor. Sorry. I think that's the challenge when it comes to the actual fighting. A second point that you made, Antonio, was about the breadth of criminalization in the name of counterterrorism. And you said it's the domain of the state, we can't do much. And obviously I'm saying, no, well, I disagree with that. The state is doing it, but the state must comply with the law when it does it. So when it is adopting laws, there is a need to engage and make sure that these laws actually comply with the human rights obligations, with the IHL obligations of the state. And it is happening. It's happening at EU level. We're in Norway. Fine. It's happening at EU level when the EU is adopting new counterterrorism instruments. It's only in the preamble. We have clear language in the preamble of the latest EU counterterrorism directive saying nothing in here criminalizes the provision of assistance as foreseen by IHL. The same needs to happen at domestic level. It's time and resource intensive. And then if the law is violated, there needs to be proceedings before the court. And I'm obviously coming to this as a lawyer. There's obviously an important advocacy dimension. So no, it is not the domain of the state, or to the extent that it is the domain of the state must comply with human rights and international, other areas of international law. Sultan, I don't know how to look at you. It's very unsettling. We need to have contact. Oh, he's gone. Okay. We need to have contact. I completely agree with what you're saying, particularly in terms of the contact dimension. Yes, it's true. It's paradoxical. You can meet them, but they need to bring their own thermos flask with tea and biscuits because, in theory, you should not be providing them anything, including tea and biscuits. You should definitely not be paying for their travel. But you can buy it for them. And these, I think we were, you're back. I think we were both at the United Nations. You're having tea and biscuits. We were both at the United Nations together, and I suspect that we were both party to over-compliance by the United Nations in terms of being too scared. But there, I think it was a conflation of the legal and the political concerns as, is the UN doing this? Why? Because the UN is a eminently state-driven body that doesn't want to give any prominence to groups, to non-state actors. I was speaking to someone who worked in peace building, or I think peace mediation for DPA for a number of years, who wasn't allowed to meet organized armed groups. And I'm saying, wait, how can we say the majority of armed conflicts today are non-international in character, and you're making peace, but you can't meet with the groups? So what's this all about? But this isn't as a matter of law, it's a matter of politics. With regard to sanctions, so the Sudan sanctions were in relation to the US. And as a lawyer, I'm very troubled by the broad margin of discretion that is afforded to states in the imposition of sanctions. I think we are seeing some progress at international level, be it at UN through the ombudsperson for delisting people under the ISIS Al-Qaeda regime, definitely at EU level where there's many proceedings for people to be delisted. That we are seeing good progress on. The imposition of sanctions, very much broad state discretion. I think it's very, very difficult to challenge that in any way. At US level, it's very difficult to challenge the listing. I was quite taken aback as a European lawyer as to the difficulties to say this individual should not be listed. Western Sahara, I'm going to have to educate myself on. And then to go back to the Taliban, I think what's important to bear in mind, and I've emphasized it a lot, is to say, look, UN sanctions do not designate the Taliban. They designate specific individuals. Let's bear that in mind. The position is different for the US. So the US has got to give effect to UN sanctions. So it cannot delist someone who's listed under UN sanctions. It's got to give effect to them. But it can go over and above them. And the US has listed the Taliban. So as far as the banks are concerned, as far as US funding is concerned, the Taliban is listed. And coming to it with my impact on humanitarian action glasses, it's very interesting to see how the US has navigated this, and it's very, very careful. It's clear that it wants humanitarian action to continue. So if you look at what's been happening progressively since August, the first was a special license for UN government and for their contractors. So anyone who receives funding from the US government to be allowed to conduct humanitarian activities. Then in September, we saw general licenses applicable to anyone that must comply with US law that allowed them to provide funds or assets to the Taliban and to other designated people. At the same time saying, financial payments can only be made for the payment of taxes, dues, import. So it appeared very broad, it was very narrow. But then at a discussion with the Ministry of Department of Treasury, which is in charge of implementing sanctions, someone said, okay, you've designated the Taliban is now in control. Does that mean we cannot make any payments to the government? Are you equating the Taliban with the government? And Treasury said, no, we're not. So you can see they are really keeping the greatest margin of maneuver possible. Compare this with the situation in relation to Gaza, where the moment Hamas won the elections, the US said, Hamas is designated under US sanctions, the US said, Hamas has a proprietary interest in the Palestinian Authority, which meant that the sanctions against Hamas applied to the entirety of the Palestinian Authority. It could have done so in relation to Afghanistan. It could have said the Taliban have a proprietary interest in the government of Afghanistan. It didn't do that. It could have imposed sanctions on the government of Afghanistan. It's done that in relation to Syria, Venezuela. It hasn't done that. So it's playing a fine line in keeping this big stick out there, but at the same time trying to give margin of movement that allows humanitarian action to continue. Is this enough for humanitarian actors? Probably. Is this enough for the banks? I don't know. And it is the banks that play a very significant role in relation to humanitarian action, but also in relation to the fluidity crisis. Long answer.
Thank you. Well, just a clarification about what I said about criminalization and the sphere of action we had. So I think we diverge there in terms of I do think there is a lot we can do, but not necessarily in legal terms. So it's so the criminalization. I mean that they have to comply with the human rights. I think they have demonstrated that they don't. But then of course we can do a lot in terms of protest, resisting, and a lot of NGOs they acted against the law. Helping and trying to help people in need, right? So sometimes it's so what I was saying is there is the legal sphere and the legal possibilities of the legal action, but sometimes we also have to look in.
But any law that criminalizes providing assistance is an unlawful law that needs to be challenged per se.
Yeah, should.
Must.
Yeah. So we have. We can take 2 more comments and then we have to close this section.
I'll be very brief. I just wanted to hi Sultan, Maria here. Just to thank you both for really interesting presentations, and thanks also for having mentioned this quite specific case of Sudan when that was on this U.S. states or list of states sponsor of terrorism, and just it made me also think back to how, in a way, the international community, but in particular the US, got sort of locked in that sanction regime also because it was imposed in the 90s. And then when in the several rounds of the US mediating for a peace agreement with South Sudan and then wanting to impose or to put pressure on the Sudanese regime in the context of the conflict in Darfur, it sort of, there was no more sanctions to impose. The Sudan was so sanctioned that it wasn't almost possible to put more leverage on the regime. And so activists at the time had to find other more original ways to sanction and defund or call for defunding of other businesses who eventually would also invest in Sudan. So it created that relationship, and at the same time, it was used as a leverage to incentivize the government in Khartoum to take part in these negotiations over all these years. Without going back to that history, but just to, as you mentioned already, it's only now last year in 2020 that Sudan was removed from that list after a change in government, after the Bashir government was toppled. So it's something about thinking about also, that in this relation where we want to use, or where there's a desire to use the sanctions also as a pressure, it's you can also find yourself in the situation where the act of removing the country from the list of states sponsors of terrorism would there wasn't much in between, in a way. It would, if they would remove that, would be to signal that now you're all good in a way. So they were. It just made me think of this this relationship back then. So just wanted to mention that at the very end. But I think there was another comment here.
Thank you. Thanks, Maria. Yes, please.
Can I ask me, or you want me to go?
It's better if you speak. Yeah.
My name is Magne Barth. I have a very old history with PRIO and then 25 years as a practitioner in the humanitarian field, most of it with the International Committee of the Red Cross in the field. And I want to thank the speakers for very interesting interventions. What strikes me, Emanuela, when you detail the complexities and the creeping, let's say, criminalization and the growth of restrictions and everything, on the humanitarian field and the actors there, I see that one particular consequence, and you can like it or dislike it, would be that probably the only ones who can actually deal with this are relatively big actors. Because it takes a lot of legal and administrative and advocacy capacity to actually handle these restrictions correctly, so that you don't find yourself with the pants down and you're arrested or you're fired or you're losing your funding and everything. So I think that's one of the consequences you will see, that either as a small organization you use an extreme amount of resources on administration and you're able to do little thing in the field, or it will favor, the whole environment will favor bigger organization or alliances, and that can actually deal with this, having also the capacity for advocacy and alliances with states. And this is, of course, where we need academics and lawyers and organizations to do advocacy in the cause of humanitarianism, to be able to try to push back on these restrictions. That's one thing that strikes me. The second I want to say, which just came to my mind when I listened about the discussion in Afghanistan, where I also worked with the previous Taliban regime 20 years ago, is that let's be cynical and look at this politically. I am quite sure that the West, with the US and others, will continue to loosen restrictions when it comes to humanitarian work in Afghanistan. Why? Because you want to keep influence in the area. We don't want, the West does not want to manage their own resources in a way which drives Afghanistan into the hands of Russia or China. The same you will see in Syria. This is my hypothesis. You will find ways to open up for and fund and support humanitarian action. People need it, and I think that's it's a good cause. I mean, irrespective of other agenda, but let's not be naive and think that there are not also political agendas using humanitarian aid in the future in needy situations, like Assad has now regained Syria like he had before. Of course, the West will want to use or to support humanitarian action in the field, and will find ways to do it with this legally. The third thing I want to say, which is a little bit like we say in Norwegian, "Vann i kirken," in this context, which was very much to curse in the church, would be the translation. The subject here was restrictions and counter-terrorism. But what I'm going to say is just, if we were in a different world with very little restrictions like we are talking about today, it is not that the humanitarian work in this context would be plain sailing for the humanitarian actors. I can tell you, when I was head of delegation for ICC in Syria in 2013-14, the UN estimated that in Syria at that time, 7 years ago, if you counted the groups that had more than 50 fighters, there were at least 2,000 of them. 2,000 armed groups in Syria with more than 50 fighters. There were huge swaths of Syria that were off limits to us for security reasons, not created by restrictions by the states in the West or the UN, but by the behavior of Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra and other groups. Today, I would assume that in Afghanistan, without having talked to my colleagues there, you have the Taliban, but you don't have Taliban everywhere. You have the ISIL, the Khorasan, you have still Al-Qaeda. So what I'm saying is that, looking at it from the practitioner's point of view, the restrictions we've talked about today are extremely important and something one has to work on, the UN, the states, the legal context. But in the reality out there in the field, there are other things which are giving more gray hair to managers and security and to humanitarian workers by the groups that are subject to the focus on these counter-terrorism measures. The fragmentation among armed groups today is enormous, very difficult to deal with. Same thing in Nigeria, for example. So I just wanted to throw it in as a complementary perspective, because this issue of restrictions we can deal with. We can call the UN, we can approach the UN Security Council and the states and have a civilized debate about how to do this. And then there's a world out there in the humanitarian field, which is extremely dangerous, and where the number of people to talk to is just limitless and very, very complicated, and it hampers the work to reach people in humanitarian aid. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, just to follow up on what you said about the size of organizations, I think sometimes we overlook the capacity to produce big responses from very small organizations. So I think in the field of criminalization, in the area of criminalization of migration, for example, the response we saw from grassroots initiatives or grassroots organizations were very strong and probably produced more effect than the policy of bigger organizations. I will give you the final word to Sultan and Manuela. I ask you to take no more than 1.5 minutes each. So Sultan, you can go first, 90 seconds, and then Emanuela.
I just think we, from a humanitarian perspective, it is about time to think of a form of professional association. I know this is an old discussion, we've been going again and again over it, but the complexities that exist in the world requires greater degree of protection, and I don't think it should be only the big agencies who are able to undertake this kind of dialogue or work and take risk. Risk has got to be taken by everyone within this kind of, having the association who could defend you, work with you, help you understand the position and so on. And that is really, really critical, I think. And the other, and it has to be really at the level of the regions where the crises are. And a Westerner, a North American, will face very, very different risks from a Middle Eastern guy working in the Middle East in the same organization and so on. And that is something that we should really keep in mind. And finally, I think in terms of the reaction of the agencies, the concern is not just over-abiding with the law, they're minimizing the response. We're going back to doing the basic nature of the response of humanitarian, the very basic definition of what would be a humanitarian assistance. And that is going back to creating dependency and really undermining local economies in a major way. So I finally just want to thank you all. I think I learned a great deal today, and it's been a wonderful session. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Sultan. Manuela, your 90 seconds.
My 90 seconds. Maria, I completely agree with you. Another conversation that needs to be had is using sanctions in a different way. They are meant to be a flexible instrument that allows pressure to be put on and off. At present, they are very blunt. It's binary. Either they're on or they're off. And it's just something that needs to be improved. I don't think improvements are going to come from Security Council level. Maybe the EU is more willing to apply sanctions, its autonomous sanctions, when it is the one imposing them in a more flexible manner. But I completely agree with you. They're not serving their purpose at the moment. Magne, to reply, who can deal with it? And I think we need to draw a distinction. And I completely agree with you that when it comes to engaging to change the laws, it's only the big organizations that have the brain space, the capacity to do this. And I have to say, I don't know if there's anyone here from NRC, but they've really been doing a phenomenal job in pushing the envelope at policy level. Thank God for NRC. Thank you, Tak. When it comes to their own compliance, I think that's different. And what I have seen, as I've said, I've worked a lot on helping NGOs with this over the years is that everyone has realized it's just part of doing business. They have educated themselves, they have put systems in place, and quite frankly, the systems to comply with the law do not need to be that complicated. I think there was a resistance initially. Why should we be doing this? We have problems. There are things that can be done quite easily in terms of screening your vendors, your contractors. It needs to be done, just do it. I think there's areas which are far more problematic, where it is important for humanitarians to develop common positions, to push back against problematic requirements. So, for example, one that's currently a problematic requirement is a requirement in a funding agreement to screen and therefore potentially exclude final beneficiaries. No, that's an absolute red line for humanitarian actors, and there it is important that there be common positions and that they push back on that. So I think that's the difference I would draw. I think more could be done by the big NGOs to share the good practices they have in place to assist the smaller NGOs. On the politics of Syria and Afghanistan sanctions, I completely agree with you. As I was saying, constantly evolving landscape. The US had comprehensive sanctions on Syria. Just a couple of days ago, they issued another license, essentially allowing NGOs to engage in reconstruction activities, which had been a no-no. So that goes to your point. In relation to Afghanistan and negotiations now, I'd be very curious to see what Russia and China say about the exception for humanitarian action. I think it'll just pass. And then finally, I'd love to hear the Norwegian idiom. I missed it, but I was smiling when you took the floor, because as I was presenting right at the outset, and I said it's the biggest challenge, I was going to add a part, of course, from security challenges due to the fragmentation of groups, but I didn't have time to do so. So I'm really grateful that you did that, Magne.
Yes, so thanks again to both guest speakers. And Maria, as some final...
Just very, very briefly, thanks a lot to all of you for excellent presentations and an excellent discussion. And to say welcome back to everyone tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for a panel where we will precisely hear more directly from humanitarian organizations on their various experiences. So very much looking forward to that. And as some others may come then, and some may not be there tomorrow, just a word of appreciation and thanks to our organizing committee. So this 2 days have been co-hosted and organized with my colleague Christopher here, who will be chairing tomorrow's session, as well as our colleague Aisha Bala Akal, who is not able to be here in person today, but has also been in contact with most of you coming here to talk. So to say thanks to her as well, and thanks a lot to Teota and Emily and Caroline also for helping out. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice evening, and hope to see many of you tomorrow as well.
Thank you.
Done.